Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development CropTalk webinar series. If you have any questions during these presentations today, please type them into the questions section of the Go-To menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentations. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Thanks, Laurie. I'd like to welcome everybody to the July 6th edition of, I think this should be the 7th. Edition of CropTalk, and today what we're going to do is we're going to go through an update of the crop, and we're going to have a kind of a general discussion throughout the whole presentation where we've got questions that have come in about individual crops, and instead of going back and forth later on, I thought we would, as I go through the crops, if the questions are there, we'll answer or try to answer them at that time. So and then we'll kind of handle the day that way. So I guess just to start off with a few beginning sides. Last week's forecast definitely was right. We definitely had a solid 5 days of heat in a row there, and I think we blew some of those highs out of the water with some 36s and 37s for sure in some cases, and even some of our evenings, I think, were a little bit warmer than were forecasted on the long range. So we went through a fair bit of heat. Some areas did report some rainfall, which is good for those areas. But I think in general, the rainfall was limited to some areas, and most areas didn't receive a whole lot of rainfall. And I think a lot of areas are still hoping for rain over the next week to 10 days here as the crop gets into the critical stage where we're going to be needing some rainfall. Surprising, I went and looked at our percent normal accumulation of precipitation from May 1st to July 4th for the province, and we're not maybe as bad off as it looks just from not getting rain. You look at the rainfall amounts in the 80 to 100%, where majority of the province would be in that range, and then some pockets were a little bit higher, and then a lot in that 60 to 80% of moisture. I think that's probably going to be a little bit surprising to a lot of people, but it's been the duration since we've had our rain, I think, is probably the biggest factor. And we had that one stretch there where we did get a lot of areas got a fairly good shot of rain, and then it's dropped off ever since. And then the hot, dry conditions definitely multiply that effect as well. One thing I did do this past week, and Marla mentioned it last week when we had some questions regarding using the soil, not really a soil probe, but the probe to test moisture. I happen to have one of those in the office, and I went out in the field and started pushing it into the ground to see how far I could push it down before it would stop the ball from going any farther. And surprisingly, was able to push it down pretty much to the limit in most areas. 3/4 would probably be a good average. So soil moisture conditions are still good enough to keep the crop growing, and I think we can see that as we look at the crop out there, and we look at how it's been taking advantage of some of the subsoil moisture right now. And as you dig down in the soil, you can still see areas where you can still dig down 4 to 5 inches, and you can still make a ball of soil that'll stick together. So I think we're lucky that way right now. But again, I think as the crops are growing, they're using a lot of moisture and giving off a lot of moisture. So we're going to need some more rainfall definitely in the next little while here. Maybe we'll just start now and start going through some of the crops, and I'm going to start off with our winter crops. We got fall rye and winter wheat that are mostly all headed out now. Some of the winter wheat in places is a little variable, I should say. It's some is headed right out and some is just nicely starting to head. Fall rye, I think, is probably the more even of the crops around, but I think both of them had a fairly hard winter and spring. And I'm thinking right now we're looking to be, yields probably that average to below average. The heads are developing well right now, so that's a good thing. But again, I'm definitely finding that the fall rye is looking better than the winter wheat, and that the winter wheat is going to be close to harvest at the same time as our spring planted wheats. I think a lot of those winter wheats have lost some time because of the spring we had, and maybe even because of the fall. So I think we're going to see a lot of winter wheat not being too far ahead of our spring wheat being harvested. So. And one of the questions I have been getting about fall rye, especially, is with the dry conditions and with the heat we've been having. Just an explanation of that falling number, and if the weather is going to be a factor in determining the falling number. So I got that question off to Anne. So Anne, if you got some comments, that would be great.
Sure. So falling number is a test that measures the amount of pre-harvest sprouting in the grain. So what they're actually measuring is the amount of alpha amylase, which is the enzyme important in germination. So it's generally measured in wheat, barley, and rye. So it is, what we look for falling number is generally we're looking for 250, and anything lower or higher would impact grain quality. So we're not looking for those really so if it's a really high falling number, that means there's low activity in the grain and it hasn't begun to germinate. And if it's a really low falling number, that means when they're doing the test, so I should have explained how the test actually works, but they basically grind up grain, make a slurry, and then it's actually measuring how long it takes a plunger to fall through the slurry. So the falling number is actually, I don't know if it's seconds or like what the actual units they're using is, but the number that they're getting, that 250, which is, around what they're looking for or higher than that, that's a measure of how long it takes that plunger to fall through the grain. So if the falling number is really low, that means there's been a lot of enzymatic activity, there's not a lot of alpha amylase left, and the plunger can fall through the grain really fast. And that's what people are trying to avoid when purchasing grain. So falling number, since it's a measure of sprouting, we wouldn't really expect to see, unless something changes in the weather, poor falling numbers this year. So it's mostly impacted by the timing of harvest. So if we do get a lot of moisture around the time of harvest and people can't get in the crop to harvest in a timely manner, then you could see more sprouting and poor falling numbers. Also, if there's lodging in the crop, that could also impact the amount of sprouting, or straight combining versus swathing. So if people do swath and then we get rain after that swath, then you'd be more concerned about having a low falling number. So this year right now, it's not something that I would be concerned about, but obviously the weather can change.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anne. Yeah, that's I guess basically we're worrying about the sprouting is our biggest concern there.
Right.
Okay. Next thing I'm going to go on to is to the cereal crops, and we're going to start with the hard red wheat. And right now, from travels, the hard red wheat, especially the earlier planted hard red wheat, and there's probably a variable in there too. The real early planted stuff is maybe not doing as good as the stuff that was sown kind of the end of April to the second week of May, and then after that we're seeing some differences. But there's a section there where a lot of the wheat got put in, and a lot of that wheat crop is looking fairly good right now. We're getting to the point now where a lot of the wheat seeded during that time period is done flowering, and we've talked about that a few times already in the last few crop talks. You look at our fusarium head blight map for July the 6th, and we're looking at very low risk of fusarium head blight. So I guess a comment, if you haven't sprayed yet, or if you're still thinking of spraying, make sure your window is fairly narrow right now, and your risk is still fairly low. So again, we're getting to the point where we're getting to the end of that season. So if you're still thinking of spraying, and a lot of people have sprayed their cereals, but I think because the crop does look pretty decent and guys are trying to get the best they can off of it. But I guess timing wise now for Fusarium may be gone, but if you're still thinking of diseases, you could still get some advantage to spraying for leaf diseases. But again, I would think our weather conditions need to change from now on to make that worthwhile as well. One of the things that we are seeing in the wheat crop is we're starting to lose some of our lower tillers, or our later tillers, I should say. And I sent this off to Anne, and a couple of questions there. How many tillers do you normally, or would an average plant usually produce? And as you can see the picture, there's the two tillers that actually form the head, and then this one here looked like it's starting to die off. If we got a rain, would that tiller start to come back? So, Anne, do you have some comments there?
Sure. So yeah, the number of tillers per plant, I would say on average, we're probably looking at 2 to 3, sometimes 4 tillers per plant. So that's you can see maybe 2 to 4 tillers per plant, but I think in general we're looking at 3 to 4 heads per plant. So anywhere from 2 to 3 functioning tillers that produce heads. Obviously, there's some range there, and it does depend on the variety and the growing conditions. So, but yeah, we definitely have seen some tillers dying off. I've been in some wheat fields that have no tillers because it's been so dry, some that just have one. So obviously not great. If we did see a rain, we could see some of those tillers coming back or new tillers sprouting. But I just think it's a bit late for those tillers to be productive and to produce heads that will be harvestable. So, we sometimes do see much shorter tillers with smaller heads, that stay green much longer. Those generally would be missing the harvest window, and sometimes they're just so short that they wouldn't be hit with the combine anyways. So I think we're probably past the point where we'd be looking at a rain coming and rescuing tillers that produce heads that can be harvestable.
Right, so basically some of those tillers are going to be more of a hindrance in the fall, especially for straight cutting, than being beneficial.
Yeah, and I think, if the grain's dry, they often just go right through the combine, and sometimes they're so short that they wouldn't be going into like a straight cut header anyways. So, but yeah, I don't think that they'd be producing productive tillers that people would be combining.
Great, thanks, Anne. Next one going out to Marla. I was at a field the other day, and the producer's wondering why he's having these strips going up and down his field. So Marla, if you could give us what you think is happening here.
You bet. Well, the first thing that I'm going to ask you, Lionel, is what crop grew before this?
It was canola.
Okay, so that is a classic canola swath syndrome showing up in the field. And so what we're seeing here is a potassium deficiency showing up in the non-green strips. And so if you think about something like potassium, it is immobile in the soil, but mobile in the plant. And so the canola, if you imagine this field being covered in canola last year, it was taking up potassium kind of evenly across the field. And then when the canola was swathed, what likely would have happened is there would have been some rainfall when the canola was lying in the swath, which leached the potassium out of the plant into the soil below. And so it kind of enriches those strips that are showing up as green with potassium. And so we end up seeing this show up in cereal crops afterwards. So now we've got a bit of an enriched strip and then a potassium low strip in between. So we see this typically on sandy soils because, again, those soils are lower in producing potassium in general for the crop. And so this is a pretty classic thing that we'll end up seeing. This year, because it's been pretty dry, we might be seeing it a little bit worse just because the ability for the plant to find or take up potassium is going to be reduced in these dry conditions as well. But again, if you see something like this, it looks to me immediately like it's probably been canola before that's been lying in the swath, and then we end up seeing that potassium enrichment in those swaths.
Okay, and now another question that I was talking to a producer yesterday about. He hadn't applied his nitrogen yet to his crop, and his wheat, he said, is just nicely starting to head out, and he was wondering if, and he says it actually still looks fairly good, and he was just wondering if applying any granular nitrogen right now would help in increasing yield, or is it just going to be for protein?
At this point, and I mean, John Hurd is the expert on this, but of course he's away this week, so that's why you're stuck with me covering. But at this point, I believe that you're not really going to see a yield increase at this point in the game if applying granular fertilizer. It's likely going to be something that's going to be helping with protein potentially. But that's really it, especially if we're putting that granular fertilizer. It also needs to be dissolved with some water and moved into the root zone for the plant to take up. And so there's a bit of time lag in there. So I wouldn't think that now is a time that we would be able to see that increase in yield. And Anne may be able to comment on that further as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's correct, Marla, that yeah, you wouldn't be looking at a yield increase anywhere around the post-anthesis application of nitrogen. So
yeah,
you could see a protein bump, and you know, it really depends. Right now, if we're seeing low yields and low kernel weights, we might have high protein anyways, just because of the way protein's concentrated in the grain.
exactly.
So yeah, it really depends on the individual situation.
Yeah, and you mentioned post-anthesis nitrogen. So when we've been looking at things with like an actual foliar spray for the purpose of increasing protein, keep in mind too that there have been occasional times when they've done that in trials here in Manitoba where there's been a slight yield decrease with that application as well, just because there is burn on the flag leaf, and that can kind of have a slight impact on that yield too. So even that it's not gonna help yield. It can potentially boost that protein a little bit, but like you said, because we're dealing with lower yields, we're likely dealing with higher protein grains to begin with.
Right, and I guess the other thing is he was going to use granular fertilizer and go over it with the floater, and the damage that he would do to the heads that are the plants that are just heading would definitely have an effect on his long-term yield too, because those plants are probably not going to come back up again. So. Okay, so the next question is for John Gavlosky. This was a picture actually taken last year, but I seen it again this year, so I figured I'd get John just to mention what's happening here. It's these cocoon-shaped eggs on the top of plants or on leaves.
Yeah, so the reason we saw a lot of these last year was because we had a lot of armyworms last year, and these aren't part of the armyworm life cycle, but they are the pupa cases of a parasitoid that often parasitizes armyworms. This particular parasitoid is called Cotesia. It's a very tiny black wasp that lays eggs into caterpillars, such as armyworms. And when the caterpillars have the parasites in them, they become quite sick eventually. Often there's dozens of larvae inside an individual caterpillar, and the caterpillar will climb to the top of the canopy where it eventually dies, which is odd behavior for a caterpillar to be high in the canopy during the day. And because they're dying high in the canopy, when the larvae living inside the caterpillar emerge, this happens very instantaneously, they spin these cocoons, usually very high in the canopy, right where they've come out of the caterpillar, in a big cluster. So when you see these, that's a good thing. That's a pupal cluster of a parasitoid called Cotesia. And just as a side note, our armyworm counts in our traps have been really low this year, and nobody's been reporting armyworm larvae this year. So you may not see as many of these clusters this year as last year.
Okay, Just let me check on a question that's coming in. Update any reports. Now we'll, I guess we'll do this now. This came in, but any reports on soybean aphids or spider mites yet? Have there been leaf beetle discoveries in any bean leaf beetle discoveries in Manitoba?
Okay, yeah, all good questions. Short answer, no reports of soybean aphid yet, which is great because normally when we have a bad year, we start seeing them in Manitoba in early July. You still can have a population develop to economic levels that arrives later in July. If we get into August before they've arrived, it's likely not going to be economical. So we're really going to keep watching carefully for the next couple weeks. If they don't arrive and start getting noticed then we're probably starting to get safe. So good news there. Spider mites, they're always around. They overwinter here. They don't have to move in like the soybean aphids. So far, there hasn't been any high populations detected. Spider mites do better in dry years. There's a fungal pathogen that is really good at knocking their populations back. So they don't do as well if we get lots of rain and humidity. If we continue to be hot and dry, you might want to check your field edges for spider mites as we get into later July and August. That's usually when the higher populations start to develop. Bean leaf beetle, we actually did find a few this year, a few. It's not a problem here. It's a rarity in Manitoba. It has been found in the past, and we had an agronomist call me about 3 weeks ago with some noticing a little bit of feeding on some soybean leaves. Thought it was grasshoppers, turned over the leaves, and there was a few bean leaf beetles. So I've got a sample of 3 of the beetles that I'm currently rearing out. We couldn't. The agronomist didn't find any others in the field. We've never seen a high population of them in Manitoba. If anyone thinks they've got them, please call me. I'm trying to track where we do find them. But at this point, it's something that occasionally we find a few of, but they just don't seem to develop into a big problem here. I'm thinking we're probably a little bit, our winters are probably still a little bit too cold for them to do well here. But like I said, something to keep an eye on.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. Next question is going to go to Ann and Marla again, and this was regarding some wheat samples that have come in or they've been talking about and seeing some spotting or blotches on the leaves. And what do you guys think this might be showing up?
Sure, I guess I can start. Marla and I were talking about this one yesterday, and we thought that it did look like chloride deficiency on the wheat. And Marla had talked a little bit about this already with other stripy wheat field. But since it is not mobile in the soil, we would expect to see more of this sort of deficiency in a dry year. I don't know if you have other comments, Marla?
Yeah, it's hard sometimes to tell, and this is kind of typical when we deal with some micronutrient, especially deficiencies, and other macronutrient deficiencies at times as well, where we see these symptoms, and it can sometimes be classic symptoms where we see these kind of blotches. Usually you would see it starting on the tip of the leaf. Is that classically, that's where you should see it, starting at the leaf tip and then moving its way down towards the middle of the leaf. And when we don't know, we tissue test. And so if you really want to be able to know what's going on in this crop, just to verify these types of things, tissue testing is important. But when we're tissue testing, just as a reminder for people as well, sometimes having a soil test along with that tissue test can help to diagnose things further, so you can see if a deficiency is possibly coming from a soil deficiency, or if it is a deficiency like, say, in a dry year we're dealing with right now, that there is sufficient amounts in the soil, but the plant just isn't able to take it up. Another comment then as well, when you're doing tissue testing or seeing these types of things in the field and trying to diagnose them, is that if you're seeing good areas of the field where you don't see the deficiency compared to the poor areas, you also want to sample both of those. because that helps to determine whether or not the actual deficiency that you're seeing in the affected area is truly a deficiency compared to the good area where you shouldn't then be seeing the deficiency. So yeah, could be chloride, but I'd be also again looking for the splotches to be starting at the tip of the leaf and then moving its way to the middle of the leaf as well in a classic chloride deficiency symptom.
Okay, guys, and while you're still in the cereal part here, a question just came in regarding wheat heads with white/bleached upper part of the head and the bottom head is still green. What do you think might have caused that? And the comment was, would it be heat stress?
So you're talking in the same head, the top part would be bleached and the bottom part of the head is green?
Yeah, the top part is white or a bleach kind of color, and on the upper part of the head and the bottom of the head is still green.
Yes, I guess if it was early seeded winter wheat, you could be looking like, you know, sometimes fusarium does have that sort of.
I think this might be spring wheat.
Okay, yeah, and if it's spring wheat, then I would expect that it's probably like a heat stress and maybe a failure for pollination or fertilization in the top part of that wheat head. So yeah, it's possible that it didn't get pollinated. There's a lot of heat stress and that part of the top of the head is starting to die off. And we do see in really dry, stressful conditions that you might end up seeing some white heads in the field just because the plant has sort of decided to abandon that tiller or that head. I'm not 100% sure if that would be the case if it was half white and half green though. If I find something different, I'll send that information to you then, Lionel.
Okay. Yeah, I know when we talked about, I think it was fall rye and winter wheat before, I think that was one of the things that was coming up is it could be heat stress. I think one of the other things, and I think Kim Brown just sent this in, she was wanting to know what was sprayed on that wheat crop. That might have some issues too that could be showing up from what might have been sprayed.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, good. Barley, going to talk a little bit about barley right now. Actually, barley has been doing fairly well. A lot of it is starting to head out. Similar to wheat, looks to be doing fairly good. I guess the biggest thing with barley is going to be the heat and the drought stress and how it'll affect test weight. And I think this seems to be something that is usually fairly common with barley. And if we get a lot of heat during heading time, they just don't seem to handle the heat, and we get lighter kernel weight. And I don't know if you've got any comments to make about that, Anne, or.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, basically as soon as the wheat is fertilized, so you know, once pollination or anthesis is over, the crop starts putting, you know, starches into the kernels. So if there is a lot of stress, if the plant is under stress and, you know, it's not photosynthesizing as much and doesn't have as much starch to put into those kernels, then you will see lighter kernels. So yeah, definitely the very dry conditions would be a concern for low test weights.
Good, okay, thanks. Oat crop is looking good. Again, similar to wheat and barley, starting to head. And I haven't seen any yet, but if we do start seeing some whitish kernels showing up, we may see some heat blasting. And I don't know if you've seen any of that, Anne, in your travels yet or not, but I know previous years, if we had stress conditions, we've seen some white panicles and no real seeds in them. And so I don't know if you've seen that yet or not.
Yeah, I haven't actually seen any heat blasting in oats yet, but you know, it is supposed to be pretty hot and still dry this weekend, so I, you know, expect that it'll start showing up pretty soon.
And before we leave the cereals, I think we need to maybe get John to make a comment regarding the grasshopper situation. I know we have some areas that it's really bad. I got a couple of calls again yesterday in the western side of the province here where producers are starting to look at spraying again. Do you have any comments, John, about the grasshopper situation and maybe how much longer it might last?
Well, it'll probably, the ones that are there may last for a while. Now, just as a side note, in your photo, you're showing a clear-winged grasshopper, and this is one that some of the reports I've had from the Southwest seems to be one of the more abundant species in that region. Clear-winged grasshopper is a grass specialist to a high degree. They highly prefer grasses. So this species here, one of the calls I had, they said they were seeing a bunch of these in their canola, just near the edge, but they weren't touching the canola. They weren't feeding on it. And will they? And the short answer is likely not. Again, if it's clear-winged grasshoppers, they prefer grasses. They'll move into the cereals, forage grasses, pasture grasses, roadside grasses. If you are cutting your roadside vegetation near a cereal field or forage grasses, note that if you do have a very heavy population of clear-winged grasshoppers in there, they're likely going to end up in your other grasses, your crops, and feed on those. Now, there are other species that'll be out there too. There's two-striped grasshopper that's abundant in some areas. It's more of a generalist. It will feed on many crops. Almost all of our field crops would be to some degree palatable to two-striped grasshopper. They have their favorites. So crops like canola, soybeans, they will feed on. It's not their favorites, but when pickings get slim, they will end up in there and they will definitely feed on those. Clear-wing being the exception, and it won't. The reason I knew this was clear-wing grasshopper, I could see those dark spots on the forewings. It's not a very well-named grasshopper. The hind wings are clear. The forewings, the ones you see when the wings are folded, actually have brown spots that are very distinctive on those wings. So if you want a way to remember it, clear-winged doesn't have, well, clear-winged does have clear wings, but the wings you see aren't clear in clear-winged. They have those brown spots. And if you can't really see it in the photo, but there's two white stripes that start on the thorax and go right to the tip of the wings as well, which is very similar to two-striped grasshopper, but two-striped will not have those brown spots on the wings. So if you're not sure, that's one way you can tell them apart.
Okay, and I did get a question. And is it a fungus that gets them that causes them to go climb up on their heads and die, or are you seeing? Question is, are you seeing any of that yet?
Short answer to that is no, I haven't seen any yet. Hopefully we do see some. So the fungus is called Entomophaga grilli, and is specific to grasshoppers and even certain types of grasshoppers. There's different strains of this fungus, and some of the strains even target certain species, which luckily include our pest species. And yeah, the fungus changes the grasshopper's behavior, and just like the Cotesia does with the armyworms, the grasshoppers end up basking high in the canopy and end up dying at the top of the canopy, which helps the fungus because eventually it builds up in their body. Their cuticle splits open because of the pressure from the fungus, and the spores can then spread to other grasshoppers because they're high in the canopy. This fungus seems to do better under damp conditions. So if we had some moisture, you would probably see more of this in the population. If it continues to be hot and dry, that favors the grasshoppers because you usually see less of this pathogen in the population.
Okay, thanks, John. knee-high by the 1st of July. I guess corn has had its challenges this spring, just like some of the other crops, but it seems to be handling them not too bad. This is probably picture I took on either just before the weekend or on the weekend when seen some of the leaves starting to curl up and trying to handle the heat we were getting. But when last couple of days when it's been cool here, you can definitely see those leaves uncurl and the corn is growing fairly well. You know, just like every other crop, it's going to need a rain here fairly quickly, but it seems to be holding on. Marla received some pictures of some corn that was showing some symptoms that weren't quite normal. And Marla, and if you wanted to make maybe a few comments of the pictures on the right-hand side.
Yeah, sure. So the question had come in about whether or not this was a K deficiency, and it has some of those characteristics. So we see, again, when we were talking about potassium earlier, we said that it's mobile in the plant, not mobile in the soil. And so because it's mobile in the plant, you'll see the deficiency symptoms happen lower on the plant, so the earlier or older leaves, because it's being remobilized in the plant to the new growth. And so you start to see these kind of classic yellowing symptoms along the outer edge of the leaf, and usually you'll end up with that green midrib still showing up. So this definitely could be a potassium deficiency in the corn. Again, tissue testing can verify what kind of deficiency we're seeing, but the question that had come in was, you know, we're seeing a lot of yellowing. Is it maybe a bit of a nitrogen deficiency as well? There can be a lot of stuff going on right now because it's been so dry and the crop is so stressed. So again, we're seeing in these photos here on the right some classic potassium deficiency signs, but we're also seeing some yellowing throughout the entire leaf. Could be a bit of an N deficiency as well. And the dry conditions, again, are likely hindering the plant's ability to take up a lot of different nutrients without having water to kind of move those nutrients in.
Okay, great. Thanks, Marla. Well, we're going to leave the cereal crops, and now we're going to get into canola. I think one of the crops that we've had probably some of the most issues in this year. Right now, in general, the crop looks to be average, and in some cases, maybe a little bit below average. We've got crops that are nicely starting to flower to getting to that stage where they're, you know, 30 to 50% bloom and looking pretty decent. But then we've got crops that are very uneven. So I think this year a lot of producers are probably looking more at spraying their cereal crops for disease than their canola crops. A lot of the canola crops, the timing would be really hard to get the proper timing to get full advantage of your spray. I know the heat the last couple of days has definitely had an effect on some of the canola that was just starting to cabbage, and where the ground wasn't covered. That ground heated up pretty good, and you could see a lot of the leaves were starting to get that bit of a twist, curl to them, just showing the stress of the heat that was happening. And then we're seeing fields like this field where you know, you've got canola that's bolted and flowering to canola that's 4 to 5 leaf stage. So again, a good example of a field that's very uneven, and, you know, trying to determine whether it's going to be a crop to spray with for disease, or whether you know, the value is there to spray for the disease. And I think Dane last week showed the canola calculator that showed whether you should spray for disease or not. And a lot of the times, I think this year it's going to come up where it's not beneficial to spray. Now, not all crops are the same, not all fields are the same, and you do see some good fields out there, and producers might want to, you know, give them a spray because just because of commodity prices. And so, you know, definitely get out there, scout your field, make sure you know, you've got a situation where the crop is in a situation where disease might affect it. I guess one thing that I didn't mention earlier on, and some areas have been getting quite a bit of fog the last few mornings. And I think because of that, we could see some disease showing up in some crops. So definitely, keep getting out there and scouting and making sure. But I think in a lot of cases, the timing is going to be the more crucial than if we do start getting some rain and some wet conditions. Marla, I got the same producer that asked me about fertilizing his wheat, also asked me about his canola. And again, he had canola in 2 different stages, one stage where it was bolting and just starting to flower, and one stage where it was in the cabbage stage. Again, benefits on putting granular fertilizer on either one of those right now. What's your opinion there?
Well, and this one's a bit tougher just because of the staginess of the crop. I don't know, again, putting down the granular fertilizer isn't going to help a whole lot if we're not getting rain to actually help dissolve that granule and move it into the crop. And so it becomes a tricky thing at this time of year, trying to get that fertilizer to the plant as it needs it. With the staginess of the crop too, I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot of benefit to the flowering canola. There might be a bit of a benefit to the kind of earlier staging, but again, with it being dry, it's a difficult call to make to try to get more nitrogen into the crop, because again, with granular, it's just going to sit there on the surface and not necessarily get in if we don't have some rain to actually help dissolve it and move it into the soil.
So here's a question for you. He hasn't put any nitrogen down this year, and this is probably one of the worst of the fields. A couple of fields, the crop was looking pretty good. So because of the dry, are we seeing more nitrogen being released from the soil right now, or is it, why is he, I guess that's what he was wondering, why is he seeing, some of his crop looking not too bad still?
Well, and that's a good question. And in a way, we could look at soil tests and try to see, what kind of nitrogen is there. The end mineralization rates, or the amount, the speed at which the nitrogen is coming out of the organic matter, or the organic portion or version of nitrogen in the soil. Heat can help, but moisture helps too. And if we have some soil moisture, that can be helping to allow some of that end mineralization to have or to be happening. The crop is, if it's rooted well, it's scavenging for nitrogen at depth too. And the one thing that we often don't talk about, especially when we're talking about things like, well, even canola, wheat, things like that, is the crop is rooting, 4 feet into the ground. And if those roots are actually getting down there, they might be also scavenging or using up nitrogen that we're not testing for in a soil test. And so if there's moisture, if there's that the root can grow through that soil and getting down deep, there might be the ability for accessing nitrogen that's kind of leached out or been moved deeper than that 2-foot soil test over the years. So these things can happen. And this is one of those years where it was kind of a perfect year to not put all of the nitrogen down earlier in the year, either in spring or even last fall, just because we didn't know what this year was going to look like. It's been so dry, the crops maybe aren't utilizing as much of that fertilizer as we would have expected. So that's maybe a good thing that we didn't put as much down. But it could, in this case, be that there's some deeper subsoil nitrogen and sulfur that crop is getting to with deeper rooting.
Okay, good, thanks. And I think one of the things we talked a little about last week was with the heat that we might see some flowers aborting and not producing pods, but we are starting to see some of that right now. So if you do going out in your field and you're seeing some, there's one where there's a pod forming, but there's one there where the flower aborted and you're not going to see pods come off those. So I think we're going to start seeing that. I think it's going to be a process over the next couple of weeks here where we will continue to see that. But I think in general, and I think Dane mentioned this last week, is that the canola crop can compensate quite a bit. It does produce a lot of flowers, and so not everyone needs to produce a seed pod for you to still get an average yield. So we're going to start noticing that over the next couple weeks here. Going to flip over to peas now, and they're actually one of the crops that's doing really well. We have very good growth, and we're seeing good pod development. The fields I've been in, the disease levels look to be fairly low. However, most producers I've been talking to have been spraying, and probably with good reason, because the crop is looking fairly good. One of the questions that has come up is, at which stage does the crop stop growing and just start producing seeds? So Dennis, if you've got a few comments to make about that.
Yeah, so typically, the various growth stages that we have, like these pods that you see in front of you on the screen right now, would be at that R3 or flat pod stage. Seed hasn't totally filled yet. They will still continue to grow for a little bit yet, depending on the growing conditions and moisture and temperature and what have you. But generally between R3 and R4, which is full pod. So once you start to see full seed pod on there, that's about when you'd start to see the maximum height of the peas at that point.
Okay, and another question for you, Dennis. Is there a way of determining yield in a pea crop? I know going out and checking some fields with the guys, and they're wondering what it's going to yield. And so at this time of year, is there a way of determining that?
At this stage, I think we're still a little bit early yet. I've always had challenges doing stand counts and doing yield estimates based on pods per plant and seeds per pod and those types of things. I just find that sometimes the numbers get very skewed because the plant populations vary. If you're going to be doing yield estimations, to me, the best time to start would be at a full pod stage, or even into beginning maturity. So at least you have beginning maturity, you have full pods set, because the part of the problem is, even at full pods, you might still have a few seeds still filling. Now, there is a formula that you can kind of calculate to determine, and again, I would probably tend to do that at the R5 stage to really get you. But it varies so much. I was doing some rough calculations this morning. So, for example, if you take 220,000 plants per acre, which equates to about 5 plants per square foot, multiply that by 5 pods per plant and 5 seeds per pod. Do the calculation, and based on an average seed size of about 2,000 seeds per pound, you get roughly about 45 bushels an acre. Now, the problem is, if you assume 7 plants per square foot, those numbers go really wonky. So honestly, when I've looked at fields, based on my experience, I can tell you if it's a 60+ bushel field, or I can tell you if it's a 25 bushel field or less, just based on the plant stance and the number of pods. But at this stage, it's still a little bit early yet. So.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's kind of like trying to guess the weight of a steer. It's you never know for sure. I know you mentioned the plant thing is a big thing. Like you go from 5 to 6 or 7, and that equation just goes crazy on you. So
yeah, exactly.
Good comments there. John, I was out in the field the other day and seen this guy hanging around on a pea plant. Took a picture of him, so you can maybe just, I think a lot of us might know what it is, but just if you could just give us some information about him.
Okay, this may fool a few people. I had somebody call me out to a vegetable field one time, and it was actually dill they were growing, and they said, we got potato beetles all over our dill, and they showed me these things, and these are lady beetle pupae. So this is pupa stage of lady beetles. So if you're seeing lots of these, then you probably had lots of lady beetles in your peas, which is a good thing because they're a predator. Now you might want to have a look and see how many aphids are there, because that's what they would be feeding on. So far, I haven't had any reports of high levels of pea aphids. Certainly, there are pea aphids in some of the peas, but I haven't had anyone report economic levels yet, which is good. And hopefully, if you have a lot of lady beetles in there, that'll help keep things from being economical.
So what stage would they eat more aphids at, this stage or the adult stage?
Well, the late instar larvae have really big appetites and actually eat the most. Adults eat quite a bit as well. The stage you're seeing here in the picture is the pupa stage. That's the non-feeding stage. That's where they're transitioning from that larval stage to the adult. And there's been some really good data on lady beetles feeding on soybean aphids and aphids in cereals, and it varies with the species quite a bit, but I'll average things out. On average, one of the later instar larvae can eat up to and sometimes over 100 aphids per day per individual, and some adults can as well. The earlier instar juveniles, it'll be a bit less, and again, these guys, the pupa, none.
Okay, good. Thanks, John. I guess a little bit about flax. There's not a lot of flax that I've seen in the travels this year. So crop again with it, I think it really depends on when it was planted. Some of the early seeded stuff maybe got hit a little bit by the frost and maybe is a little bit thinner than some producers would like. And then some of the kind of the mid-May to late May kind of seeded stuff was able to get out of the ground fast and is doing okay. I've seen some fields where I think the biggest effect we're going to see is it flowers. Each flowers for one day. So if we had a lot of heat and it was during that time when most of your flax was flowering, you might see some reduced yields that way. But again, it's a crop I think this year that really depended on when it was planted. And if you could have avoided those spring frost and cool weather, I think you're seeing a better crop than the ones that had to suffer through that. And again, applications of fungicides, have been happening, but again, it's this year. It's all depends on what the crop looks like, and if the crop looks like it's worth it, I think guys are still doing it. But if it's a variable crop and there's lots of spaces between plants, I think guys are thinking that it'll do well without having to spray. Dennis, I guess regarding the soybeans, I think and what I've seen that they're looking a little bit shorter than normal, but they're handling the dry weather, pretty good, and seeing a lot of them in that V3 to R1 stage. What are you seeing in your travels? And then maybe you can make a comment about dry beans and kind of what they're doing as well.
I guess depending on the fields, it was interesting because I was actually looking at my soybeans this morning as my day started, and the stands look wonderful. Like there's nice even stands. They are a little shorter. They will continue to grow. Like once they hit early flowering, usually about doubling in size from now till the time that they quit growing into that late R5, early R6 kind of thing. And for the most part, I think they're doing all right. Nodulation seems to be okay on the soybeans this year. And staging was actually in one field yesterday that actually starting to show first pods already, actually, on the lower plants. So overall, I think pretty good. They're rooting down quite nicely this year. Really not too much to say about iron chlorosis this year. It's actually pretty minor for the most part this year, but we just haven't had any wet conditions, and areas where it's more salt induced, they seem to grow out of it fairly quickly. So as far as dry beans out there right now, I guess as far as we're getting close to fungicide season, probably going to see, we're already starting to hear reports of some of the earlier types like late red kidneys and cranberries just starting to flower now. So they may be the first types that growers will spray. But these kind of things with dry beans, when you're spraying for white mold, one of the big things to be cognizant of is variety susceptibility, density of the canopy, and air movement through the canopy, as well as moisture. So we've been fairly dry for the most part in this area. We've picked up a few little showers. So what I would caution growers on is when you're making your decisions to spray for white mold, kind of look at those factors. You know, if you can still walk down the rows of your dry beans and the rows aren't touching, that means you have pretty good air movement and not a very dense canopy. So you may not need to spray in those situations. If however, though, you're in a very sheltered area, not a lot of air movement, lots of plant growth, and even we're noticing now we're getting a few more dews in the morning, those are the fields I would first consider to spray for a fungicide application. Other than that, I've been getting a few calls. I'm going to be going out in the next day or so looking at a few kidney bean fields. We're starting to see some of the blights show up, and there's some few other issues with some herbicide residues starting to show up as well from previous years due to the dry conditions. But overall, I think no real major issues in the dry beans this year other than all the wind that we had early on. So.
Okay, thanks, Dennis. Next question goes to Kim, and there's a couple things that Kim's going to be talking about here. One is she's got a few slides regarding Kosha and pigweed, and then starting to get some questions on managing the foxtail barley. So Kim, if we can give you the screen and take it away.
Any of that yet?
Can you make it in presenter mode, Kim? Just slideshow?
Oh, yeah, sure. I just wasn't sure if you could see it. I have two screens running and one's not running well.
That's all right.
Sorry. There we go. Okay, this will just be real quick. We just have a few minutes left. Oh yeah, I do have to switch my display settings. Sorry. Whoops. I did that wrong.
It looks good right there.
It looks all right. Okay, we're good then. Sorry.
No problem.
And there we go. Okay. Sorry about that. Just really quickly, I wanted to talk about herbicide-resistant weeds because if you've been reading our crop pest report that comes out later today, some of our crops are 6 weeks now post-spraying, or maybe up to 6 weeks. We are still spraying herbicides on our late canola and things like that, and maybe our last little bit of soybeans is getting their second spray. But basically, we're at the end, and so any of our weeds that are showing up now, there's a reason. Maybe we've missed them completely. Maybe it was a spray miss. Maybe there was something, maybe the wrong chemistry was picked. But we really do need to be aware of the herbicide-resistant weeds and watching them. Kosha, Waterhemp, and wild oats are just 3 that I want to talk about really quickly. Not going to read much of this because we've seen some of this before, and we can go through this more in the winter. But we know Kosha and I did see some of that, I think, in that corn picture that you showed earlier, Lionel, and it looked quite green and not dying. So this is something to watch. And so we do see, when we're looking at Kosha, lots of times we will see perfectly nice green healthy plants like this one right here. There's a dead plant right there, and then but over here where my pointer is, there's a nice green healthy plant. In this case, in the next picture, in this next red circle, we see one that's probably going to be dead, and the one next to it's yellowed, but I would say that's probably going to come back. So we have different degrees, and with Kosha, there's different. It's gene amplification of the resistant gene to glyphosate, and so however many copies of that gene are there, that's why we get these varying stages of death and dying. So we will have something that's completely dead next to something that's kind of sick, next to something that's kind of that's actually quite green, like this one right here in this picture, big and not affected whatsoever. So really want to be watching those Kosha populations. In the future, just quickly, and we do not have group 4 resistant Kosha here that I know of. It may be here, we just don't know about it. But they did find that when they did a test in 2017, so it's getting to be a few years ago now, they found that in Alberta, that 100% of the Kosha they tested was resistant to group 2. That's not surprising. I would expect our numbers are very, very close. They found 50% were resistant to glyphosate, that's group 9, and they also found 8% dicamba resistant, which is scary when we're looking looking at our Extend beans, and we've got those beans, and that's a good way of getting rid of Kosha, of herbicide-resistant Kosha. But that is something to be aware of, that there is dicamba resistance out there in Alberta, and they did find that 10% of the samples were resistant to all three. In Manitoba, this is glyphosate-resistant Kosha in 2016 and 2018, and I'm hoping to update the map this summer. These are samples that came into PSI Labs, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. That's the Pest Surveillance Initiative lab that's in Winnipeg, and this is the glyphosate resistance. So they only get samples in that are suspected resistance. So it's not necessarily an entire population's been sampled, but this is what we're showing for that we know has resistance, and it's definitely growing. So the PSI labs for Kosha testing, it's DNA tissue testing for glyphosate resistance, which is group 9. Because it's a DNA tissue test, you need green and growing tissue. So you need to be doing it. You can start now. You can actually send them in at any point as long as they're still green and growing. But I know they are starting to get some samples in. And one sample is paid for if you are a Manitoba Canola Growers member. You can send in up to 8 plants per sample. But if you go on their webpage, they've got instructions on how to submit and everything like that. But Manitoba Canola Growers members do get one free sample of this, as well as some other tests that they do there. And it will tell you how many copies of the resistant gene you have. Because it's gene amplification, we see varying degrees of resistance, and basically over 3 copies of the gene is considered resistant. They routinely see in the double digits for number of copies, and they've seen as high as 90. So that would be kind of like a super resistant Kosha. You're never going to kill that thing ever with glyphosate. This is just an example of what you would get. You would get the sample in, and it says suspected glyphosate resistant Kosha testing program. This is the results. This would be your location. And then basically you get something like this. If it's less than 2 copies, it's susceptible. If it's more than 3 copies, it's considered resistant. And again, there's degrees of resistance, but basically anything more than 3 copies. And then there's just some information down here about the test. But it's very simple. You either get a green bar that you go ahead and still use glyphosate, or red, it's not going to work for you any longer. Talking about Waterhemp, we've talked about this one a lot. This is the North Dakota distribution map. It's at the border. It's here. It's in Manitoba. This is our 2019 map. We haven't updated this in a while. We'll be updating this again this summer because we anticipate finding more of it. And again, so we're looking for Waterhemp as well as Palmer Amaranth. That's us right there in Carmen in that star. And this is what our Waterhemp looks like. Basically right now, any of you that have pigweed in your fields, I want you to be looking at it. And if it's a pigweed, please stop and take a look at it. Make sure you take your glasses because you got to have a good look at it. And so you have to pull them up. You have to take a good look. The pigweeds all look quite similar, especially when they're small. There are some distinguishing characteristics, but these can be huge yield robbers, especially in our corn and soybeans. There's really very little in-crop options in our corn and soybeans. In our other crops, like our wheat or canola, or our cereals and canola, we've got lots of good options. So we seem to be all right. But between in corn and in soybeans, there can be some tremendous losses. Anyways, Waterhemp is smooth, and other species that we are concerned about is Palmer Amaranth. That is like worse than Waterhemp, and we don't know for sure that we have it in Manitoba yet. It's not been confirmed, but we are out looking for it, and we actually suspected we might have found it in a field yesterday, and the samples are being sent away for DNA analysis to find out what it is. Red root pigweed has hairs. If you have a pigweed in your field that does not have hairs, we need to find out what it is. And we also need to do the genetic testing to know what it's resistant to, because these are dioecious, which means male and female plants. Our Waterhemp and our Palmer Amaranth are dioecious. So we have a lot of outcrossing, so we have a lot of hybridization. And because of that, the genetic resistance grows very, very quickly because of the outcrossing. This is just quickly in Manitoba. In 2019, they sampled 6 different fields, and they sampled these went to Ontario, which is where my samples that we took yesterday are going today. They're being purulated there today. So we will have some results on some stuff that we found just recently here in Manitoba, but this is Waterhemp that was confirmed in Manitoba a couple of years ago, tested for group 2, group 5, group 7, group 9, and group 14. Pretty much across the board, it was resistant to group 9, and it was pretty much resistant to group 2 as well. So with the group 2s, they test for a couple of different types of group 2 resistance. So far was group 5, group 7, and group 14 were still working, but we know that resistance comes on very quickly in these populations. So we had only found Waterhemp in the province starting in 2018 was the first time it was found, and the samples that were being sent away for resistance testing in 2019 were already coming back basically full-blown group 9 and group 2 resistance, which again, once you get to that really severely limits your in-crop options in crops like soybeans and corn. And so what to do when you have Waterhemp, again, good chance it's group 2 and group 9 resistant. Doesn't appear to be a problem in corn and wheat and canola. Big problem in corn and soybeans. The PSI lab as well is doing some testing for this. They are starting to get some testing in, and they can find out which species we're dealing with. Is it a Waterhemp? Do we have Palmer? Is it one of the other pigweeds that are not nearly so competitive, but they really look a lot alike right now. The big thing is if it has hairs, it is a red root pigweed, which we have a lot of group 2 resistant red root pigweed anyways, but that's not nearly the problem as if it was Waterhemp or Palmer Amaranth. So again, if you see pigweed, please take a look at it and let me know. We're coming out and we're looking at different fields. I'm on my way to Southwest Manitoba after this call to go look at another suspected Waterhemp / Palmer Amaranth problem. So when we're just quickly about wild oats, we can't do much about wild oats right now. We basically want to collect the seed, but we do have a number of, the resistant wild oat population is growing. Group 1 and group 2, we have multiple group resistance. There's also group 8 and some group 15 resistance as well in Manitoba. This is our herbicide resistant weed survey. We will be redoing that next year when we do our full-blown weed survey. So we will be updating this for 2022, and I expect those numbers will climb again as they have from previous surveys. It just keeps growing. So again, here's just an example. These are susceptible wild oats that got sprayed. These are wild oats that didn't die. And basically, there is group 15 resistance. It's been found. That's our sulfentrazone, which is in focus. It's our Zidua, so it's in a couple of other products as well. It was unexpectedly found in Manitoba a few years ago, but again, we don't think this is full blown yet, but it's something that we are definitely watching for, is that group 15 resistance, because that's one of our few products left that has some activity on wild oats when our group 1s and group 2s no longer work. Sampling with them for resistance. So we're a little early, obviously, but we need to gather mature seeds. So when we get closer to grain harvest, wild oats will start to drop seeds early. Use a sweep net and gather the seeds, and we can talk about this later on, and we'll talk about different labs to send to it and how to deal with it if you think you've got some resistant oats that need testing. But something to watch for. They will be starting to poke their heads up above the crop now, and so just keep an eye on them, and if you plan on sampling, just make sure you get in there and get those seeds before they drop to the ground. And after that, I think then we had a question on foxtail barley. Lionel, is that right?
Yeah, it was just if I wanted to start managing it before, would it be this fall? What should I be looking at doing this fall?
Yeah, fall spraying. I mean, it's a perennial, and it's a simple perennial. It spreads by seed. So if you've got it and the fluff is flying around, there's going to be new ones coming. But it is a bunch grass, and it's going to be coming back. So starting, a fall spraying program, even with glyphosate. I know we've gotten away from fall sprays in the past. Your pre-harvest spray is not going to do anything to foxtail barley, but a fall spray program with some glyphosate, and obviously we'd want to be throwing in another product for the other weeds that are there to preserve glyphosate. What is working really well in spring wheat, so we do have an option in spring wheat for if you do have some fields that have a lot of foxtail barley. The Olympus Pre Spray, it's a Bayer product, and it's a group 2 graminicide. So but it has been working really well, but it has to be followed up in crop with something like a Vero, or Vero was also in Velocity. So that system is working really, really well to take Foxtail barley, but only out of spring wheat. In other crops, it's more challenging, but that is something I would seriously consider if you've got a problem in a field this year and that's going into spring wheat next year, that same field. I would be looking at those herbicide options to try to tackle that next year. But for sure, this fall, trying to get back into a fall spraying program with glyphosate and then something else thrown in there so that we're not spraying glyphosate alone. That would be something that we may, can kind of get a crack at it and get some of that herbicide down into the roots.
Okay, good. Thanks, Kim. I think what we're going to do now is go to a couple of slides to end it for today. And I just want to mention again about the funding for water sources for livestock producers. If you're in need of water, there's definitely a program here through the Environmental Farm Plan. It's BMP 503. Definitely go and look that up if you're needing to do some work. There's assistance to do that. Also, if there's producers that are looking at marketing hay or marketing green feed, if you've got a crop that you would rather or think you might be better off taking it for green feed, we do have our hay listing that is going up again. And so if you do anything like that, definitely contact crop insurance first, because they'll need to come out and assess your yield. But if there's going to be or maybe a potential for some sales in feed this year, so definitely if you got a crop that might not be worth harvesting, might be worth some money for selling it as feed. Again, our books for the field crop protection, the ag adaptation specialist in the province, and there's our names and contacts. And join us next week, July the 14th. I'd like to thank our panel today. They did a great job answering all the questions that came in, and we went through a lot of stuff. So thanks again, and join us next week, July the 14th, for the next edition of Crop Talk. Thanks.